So recording started, may as well begin. So today we will be finishing up on political parties in the states and localities. So last time we talked a little bit about, say, some of the elements in terms of civil society, interest groups, things of that type. Today we'll kind of talk about political culture, some structural issues, and then get to the political parties themselves. So political culture is something that's been mentioned in the textbook, at least, earlier on in the semester. This tends to be a little bit more ambiguous in some senses. So in terms of if you're trying to figure out what concretely it is, it's not something that's as easily measured, but instead talks about the sort of lived existence of an area, kind of differences between them. So for instance, in say a more traditional kind of state, if you're a political party or interest group or part of civil society, if you're trying to engage the population, you're probably going to be going to church events or dealing with charitable organizations like the Love Club. So sort of a localized form of, usually oftentimes of business people. They're involved in certain types of charitable donations or organizations inside a smaller community. Versus say in more progressive states, oftentimes you'll have bigger focuses on like petitions, trying to get people to sign petitions, as well as sort of larger protests or marches or that kind of thing, because it just tends to be something that is more amendable to people in those sort of populations. This can oftentimes touch on the broader culture of an area itself. So for instance, we're dealing with like a rural states like Montana or Wyoming. Generally, if you're say a local politician or a state politician, the kind of events you're going to go to would be things that are more rurally focused. So like say events by the 4-H club. So the 4-H club is effectively a youth organization for kind of preparing people to be farmers. It has events like cattle roping, where it can grow the biggest type of squash or something of that type, rodeos, various types of things like veterans parades or something like that. That's where you're going to start seeing more people, and that's where a local politician or a local party is going to want to be more involved. Versus say in more urban areas, generally it would be things like, again, protests, parades, things of that type would be where you'd be more focused. That said, it's also dependent upon demography. So let's just focus on progressive states and urban areas. So if you're trying to interact with, say, populations that are sort of maybe more upper middle class and white populations, you're probably going to try and focus more on going to like bookstores of some type, or especially certain types of forming certain types of cocktail parties or something like that to try and encourage people to show up. Versus say if you're trying to interact more with say African American communities, which tend to have a much higher percentage inside cities who will have regular church attendance. There you would probably be focusing more on church activities and things like that to try and address that population. There can also be certain structural issues that can affect participation. So things like how well developed the party organization is, especially in localities. So for instance, in some localities, a political party may not really have much of a presence just because it doesn't have much luck. So for instance, say in some of the richer suburb areas of Cook County or of Chicago, yeah, there's technically a Republican Party local office, but doesn't really do much because they just don't have very much luck in elections there. Similarly, you may have like a Democratic Party office someplace in some of the more rural areas of Texas, in northern Texas, but they probably don't have much luck. Also, things like how decentralized or centralized the political party is. If you have one of those dominant cities in a state, so like New York or New York City or Chicago or something like that, as well as certain types of regulations. So some states may have stricter regulations on dealing with unions or dealing with businesses than others do. And then finally, there could be structural, historical issues. So one of the typical ones being the Solid South. So from about the 1870s until, depending on how you want to look at it, the 1970s to the 1990s, generally speaking, in the South, the Democratic Party was dominant, even though, especially on certain cultural issues, Democratic Party in the South tended to vary pretty significantly with the Democratic Party in the North or the West. The reason was historical, because in the South, generally the view was the Republicans were the party of the Union, they were party of the Union Army during the Civil War, and therefore kind of viewed as enemies. So generally speaking, after Reconstruction, Republicans just couldn't win office for the next 100 years within the southern states. Again, historical quirk. Which now brings us to parties themselves. So again, in the United States, we're talking about parties that matter. There are only two, the Democrats and the Republicans. There are smaller parties, but generally they don't really have much of an effect. Now, we've already talked briefly about it. We'll talk about it a little bit briefly again. The big reason for this is the first past the post system in American elections versus proportional representation. That because of this, in order to win some sort of office, you need to get 50% plus one of the vote, which means that there's a structural incentive for a party to try and be broad enough to be able to get that 50%. Versus in a proportional representation system, where as long as you have something like 5 or 8% of the vote, you get seats in parliament. As long as you can only, if you can appeal to 20% of the population, you're still going to get some sort of office. While you have, say, places like Italy or elsewhere, where they'll have multiple parties that are relevant. Now, each of the political parties in the US has a platform. So each 4 years during the presidential election, you have the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention. So again, the 50 state convention, parties coming together to sort of form what their idea is. Parties generally have a platform. It says, what do they believe? But there's differences between the Americans and others places, especially Europe. Generally with Europe, when there's a party platform, the idea is if the party wins the election, they're going to put through that platform pretty specifically. In the United States, that tends to be not so much the case. So do party platforms matter in the US? The answer, while unhelpful but accurate, is no and yes. On the one hand, no, they don't really matter. So in terms of, they're not really like so if you're looking at Europe, oftentimes the party platform will have basically bullet points saying that if we get the majority inside the parliament, we will do A, B, C, D, E. And generally speaking, they will do that if they get that dominant vote. In America, not so much. Again, because of the first past the post system, the American system tends to be very candidate focused. And that being the case, especially if you're someone inside a district, whether state or national, but in both, if you're in a district that can kind of vary between the parties, you can't be too lockstep. You have to make certain types of exceptions. You have to make certain types of allowances to make sure you can still get that 50% of the vote. That tends to mean that there's not as much party discipline in the US. The party can't really force people to do things in the same way that the Europeans can. That said, platforms still are useful because they give you at least a general idea about what the parties actually believe. What are they generally aiming for? Certainly there can be exceptions. Certainly there are going to be a lot of exceptions. But it gives you sort of a broader notion of, okay, if I'm thinking, what do Democrats want or what do Republicans want? At least gives you sort of a broad idea of what generally their preferences would be. That inside some sort of perfect scenario where they had 100% control over everything, what would they likely do? And this is useful because then when you're looking at a candidate, you can say, all right, even though there are going to be variations with this particular candidate, they're probably going to lean in one way in this sort of general direction that the platform says. So it gives some clarity for a constituency that it can, for voters, so they can kind of figure out, okay, so I'm not going to know specifically everything about a candidate, most likely. By looking at their party affiliation, I can at least get some general ideas about which way they're going to lean on any given issue. That's helpful. That helps in terms of trying to gather information, especially because, again, most people have lives, they have better things to do with their time than, just going through every single thing a candidate has ever done. This serves as sort of a heuristic, again, that mental shortcut to give you sort of an idea of what to expect. So that being the case, let's talk briefly about what are some of the general policy preferences between the two parties. Now, having said that, there are going to be some differences we'll talk about from the slides that, especially in the last few years, things have become a little bit more complicated. The joys of politics can never be simple. One thing to note, though, and this is something especially for almost anything dealing with politics, but especially politics inside a democratic or representative system, the types of language that you use tends to be important. That, and this is actually a place where we can use a particular term. This is where the issue of framing comes in. One of the most important things that a political party or a candidate is going to try and do is frame an issue. How you talk about it is in many ways going to influence how people can think about it. This is one of the quirks, maybe not one of the more beneficial ones, of politics itself. Because oftentimes the idea is that if you can, to use a different sort of terminology, it's like battle space preparation. If you can solidify the population to use a term you prefer, in some ways you've already half won the argument because people are thinking along the lines of those specific terms. So if we're looking back to like 2010, 2011, when there was the debate about the healthcare changes inside the United States at the federal level, at the national level, one of the big issues was how are you going to describe it? So for those who were in support of it, they usually described it as universal health coverage. Especially when there were some more problems arising with it, their opponents tended to prefer to call it Obamacare. They're both talking about the same thing. They're talking about the same policy, but they choose these terms specifically. Universal health coverage. Why would you choose that term? Because it sounds good. I mean, everyone wants health coverage. You don't want to leave anyone out if you don't have to. You don't want to cause problems with people. You know, universal health coverage just sounds wonderful. Who would be against that? It's like saying, are you against your mother? Who would be against that? That's important because if you're getting involved in an argument, the first thing that's going to happen is someone saying, okay, no, I'm against this policy. The first question that someone's going to say, well, why would you be against healthcare for people? That seems odd. Obamacare, on the other hand. Again, when there were starting to be problems in terms of costs or even the implementation, big reason for this was to attach it to a specific politician, the person who was backing it, President Obama, because the idea was to say, yes, look at what a mess this is. This is the person who's responsible. So if someone was talking about, okay, my health insurance has tripled in cost thanks to Obamacare, this is a way of trying to kind of align that issue with a specific politician in the hopes of being able to vote them out of office. Probably the best example of this, most typical, and especially one that touches on national, state, and to a certain extent even local, would be the terminology of pro-choice versus pro-life. These are terms that come up dealing with the abortion debates in the United States. Both of them are talking about whether there should be stronger or lesser regulations on the procurement of abortion within a state or locality or the country itself. Why do they choose these terms? Again, as a matter of framing. So if you're saying you want to have less restrictions on abortion sort of things, on abortion procedures and so forth, saying pro-abortion, which is something that they're called at certain points, can have sort of a negative connotation. Because the idea is that generally speaking, even if you think it's something that should be allowed or something that should be, that especially in some cases would be maybe even necessary, it's not really a happy thing by any stretch. It doesn't sound positive. It's kind of like saying being pro-chemotherapy. Yes, you want people to be able to take chemotherapy for cancers, but chemotherapy isn't a fun procedure. It's not something you generally would prefer to do. Being pro-chemotherapy just sounds kind of off. So thus, change the language pro-choice, because we like choice. Choice is good. Choice is freedom. Pro-choice is a way of framing it to say that, okay, if someone's saying you want more restrictions, sort of initial argument becomes, okay, well, are you against freedom? Are you against choice? Again, battle space preparation. So too for pro-life, those who are against, say, those who want greater restrictions on abortion procedures or even banning them. For them, the view is that, okay, abortion is the extermination of a human life. So the idea is, well, we'll be pro-life. Again, framing and battle space preparation. If someone says, well, no, we should allow more of this, the response is, well, so you're okay with killing innocent people who can't defend themselves. This whole life thing just isn't really too important to you. Immediately puts the other person on the defensive. No, of course I like life. It's just then something else to justify that. Framing becomes a key thing in politics, especially in electoral politics. If you can basically set up the language that's going to be used, you in effect can half win your battle before it even starts. Both the political parties, speaking almost anyone who's involved in politics who's good at it, makes it a very big point to try and get those words the way they want. So too with the party names. So it's not that Republicans hate democracy. It's not that Democrats want to go back to the Athenian system of democracy and mass rule. It's not that the Republicans, want to have a Republican system like the Roman Republic and Democrats don't like it. It's just they're both positive terms to make a positive impression. Republicans like the Republic, Democrats like democracy. It doesn't necessarily reflect any sort of deeper policy preferences in this case. So with all that prefacing, and after a full previous lecture, what do they actually prefer? So let's talk about the preferences of parties. Now, again, this is broadly speaking, especially if you're looking at specific states or even sometimes specific localities, there can be variation. But if we're broadly looking at if you'd say a Democrat, whether they're in New York or Nebraska or Oregon, what would they generally lean towards? This will give us sort of an idea. So too with the Republicans in a moment. So in terms of its general ideology, it would be progressive or liberal in the American sense. The Americans tend to have different uses of terminology. So the American use of the term liberal would be not the same as the use of that word by the British or the Australians. We'll get to that in a moment. So progressive is probably the better term. And for both Democrats and Republicans, just for simplicity's sake, we're going to kind of break down their preferences on economic issues and on social issues. There's a host of other issues that come in, of course, but this helps kind of simplify things a little bit. And again, because some of the others can vary significantly. So on economics, generally speaking, Democratic Party, whether at the national level or at the state level, tends to prefer a pretty interventionist government. So that would mean a government that is involved in much more heavy regulation. In earlier periods, even things like nationalization of certain types of industries, much more involved in, say, closer control over various industries, much more intervention by the government into the economy. And it tends to do so for two big reasons, more or less. So the first reason is for social justice. So the idea for under this sort of notion is that an unregulated economy, an economy that's kind of left to its own devices, is going to lead to very severe inequalities. And these inequalities cause poverty, causes lack of political participation, and especially is also connected with various forms of like racial, gender, sexual identity types of discrimination. That in effect, it allows the dominance of some over everyone else, whether it's dominance of the rich over middle class and poor, whether it's the dominance of, say, men over women, whether it's the dominance of straights over heterosexuals over homosexuals, transsexuals, or various others, domination by whites over blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and whoever else. That these sort of things are interconnected, because the notion is that with an unregulated economy, this allows for these kinds of invidious types of prejudices to form and solidify. And that one of the big jobs of government is to try and break those down, to try and increase equality or equity, I guess is the term that's preferred now. But there's another element to this too. And this is something that goes back much earlier. This even goes back to the very first progressives, so in the late 1800s. That the notion is an unregulated economy is inherently irrational because it's relying on uncoordinated market forces, and that this causes chaos. So oftentimes you'll hear talk about the business cycle, where things will be going very well, you have a boom, everyone's making money, things are going nicely, and then eventually you have a bust. You have the economy start to crash out. You either have, say, like high inflation, or you have a lack of employment, or things of this type. The notion is that the unregulated economy is inherently irrational. It's always going to be having these ups and downs, and it's always going to be chaotic. Versus a more rational system, where the idea is that if you try and rationalize the economy, if you try and make it follow certain types of rules, if you try and make it more consistent, and especially if you have it spearheaded by an agency that is effectively non-profit oriented, which would be the government, this can alleviate those sort of problems. That by having, because the notion is that any one corporation is going to be looking for profit. It's going to be looking for profit, is going to be thinking generally short term, which means that you do start having these ups and downs, that its short-term profit focus makes it, and just focused on its own firm, its own corporation, is going to lead to chaos. Versus the government, which doesn't necessarily have this kind of profit focus, can think of the broader general interest, general public good, which can regulate, which can control, can intervene to try and calm this sort of thing down, is the idea. Now, this is also where we get to one of the variations inside the slides. This has changed somewhat, especially in about the last 4 or 5 years. While much of this still remains accurate, the Democratic Party in some ways has become much more comfortable with at least certain types of corporations and generally leaving them to their own devices, or more of an idea of a private-public partnership. This especially comes in with, say, high-tech industries. So social media, Facebook, Google, things of this type. But they tend to be much, at least for these types of corporations, they tend to be much more willing to kind of let them be, as long as they're kind of working in coordination in some sense, informally with various government agencies. As oftentimes happens with parties, whichever party exists, one of the reasons for this change may be ideological, that they've had different views about how the economy works, but another part of it can significantly be who are your donors, or who are your supporters, who is your constituency. So during the last, actually about the last 10 years, big tech has tended to be very much in support of the Democratic Party. That has likely helped kind of shift its views on some of these issues. So Google, for instance, or the Alphabet Corporation, I think is its technical name, had a great deal of interaction with something like the Obama administration. If you look at a state like California, Facebook, Google, other sort of things of this type have a very strong stranglehold on things and tends to very much support the Democratic Party. Obviously, that can have a shift. And again, that happens with just about any political party. If your constituency starts to change, especially in terms of donors, your ideology can kind of start to shift as well. Then there are social issues. So these would be more cultural issues dealing with, say, regulation of interactions between people inside a given country or state or something of that type. It was considered to be, say, moral, correct, equitable, that kind of thing. In this area, it tends to be significantly more varied. So on some areas, the Democrats tend to emphasize a lack of government intervention. They tend to support removing government intervention from various issues. Two of the big areas of this would be reproductive freedom and sexual freedom. So reproductive freedom, again, dealing with framing of terms, this generally dealing with things like abortion, birth control, topics of that type, where the notion is to remove more regulations. So in a place like, say, New York, this would have been maybe 2 years ago, the state basically tried to remove restrictions on abortion up to about, as memory serves, up to about 2 weeks before birth. So pretty much allowing it for almost anything at any point during pregnancy. Lack of government intervention. So too with things like sexual freedom. So for like say the decriminalization of homosexuality or the decriminalization of certain types of pornography or certain things of that type. Again, the idea of allowing for removing government intervention. That said, in other areas, Democrats tend to prefer a great deal of intervention into social issues. So this can involve things like health, broadly defined. So things like putting limitations on the size of soda drinks, like they had in New York City. So the idea being that the population is either unaware or incapable of controlling itself in terms of sugary drinks. So putting in requirements saying, okay, a sugary drink like a soda can only be a certain size, to try and change that. To a certain extent, now looking at things with, say, vaccine mandates or mask requirements and things of that type as well. Much more of a focus on, yes, the government should have the authority to be able to mandate to a business that it's above a certain size that their employees should take the vaccination or potentially lose their job, something of that type. Pretty strong intervention. This can also come in with certain types of expression. So generally speaking, Democrats have usually been, or have increasingly been, supporters of the creation of things like hate speech laws. So that if someone is using offensive language or terminology, especially against certain types of marginalized groups, that this would move towards something that would be potentially even a criminal offense, or at least a civil one in some ways. This also touches on some of the discussion more recently of things like misinformation, of okay, that someone could be held civilly liable for misinformation. These things being kind of pretty big restrictions on elements of the First Amendment's freedom of speech and press. And again, leading kind of the issue of, okay, so what counts as hate and what counts as misinformation? We'll see how that turns out for the next couple of years. Now we come to the Republicans. Now, the Republicans, generally speaking, tend to be conservative, is the usual terminology for them. Or if we're going to, and this is actually something I mentioned, if we're talking about progressives, usually the terminology for progressives is they are on the left, and that conservatives are on the right. The origins of left-right comes from the French Revolution, but the more radical parts of the new French government sat on the left part of Parliament, while those who tended to be more for status quo or conserving elements of the previous system kind of sat on the right part of Parliament. Just in European and Western tradition over the last 230 years, that's kind of stuck. So conservatives, rightists, progressives, leftists. So the Republicans tend to be conservative, and especially with their orientation towards free markets. So this would be, so if you're looking at Australians or British, when they talk about a liberal, they mean someone who's focused on free markets, and a British or Australian liberal would be like an American conservative, because just kind of like with the metric system or other things, we Americans kind of like doing things a little differently than everyone else, because why not? So we just make things much more complicated than they need to be. Now, one of the things to note about the Republican Party, and one of the things we'll talk about in a moment about how it's been sort of changing, is that so we kind of briefly mentioned earlier on in the semester that the parties, because again, they're trying to get 50% of the vote, they kind of act almost like umbrella organizations. That if America had a proportional representation system, almost inevitably, the Republicans and Democrats would both break apart into 3 or 4 or 5 separate parties, because they're acting as a coalition of various types of groups. This is especially the case with the Republicans, where they tend to have very hardcore free market types of individuals, very big business focused individuals, those who are more focused on, say, the economics of small businesses, very strong social conservatives, especially religious social conservatives, but also very strong sort of freewheeling libertarians who want pretty much all regulations removed. Generally speaking, various parts of these coalitions do not like each other terribly much. But what held them together was during the Cold War, so during that extended period from the 1950s, 1940s, up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the conflict between the Americans and the Soviets, the thing that linked all of these groups together is they were ardently anti-communist. Cold War ends, and this is one of the reasons you start seeing some more fracturing in parts of the Republican Party, because we kept them together isn't there anymore, at least not as explicitly so. So just like the Democrats, looking at two elements, economics and social issues. So on economics, generally speaking, the Republicans have tended to prefer less government intervention. They tend to be more on the idea of keeping an unregulated market. So there are a couple of reasons for this. First is the belief that where for the Democrats, they see the free market system as uncoordinated and irrational. For the Republicans, they tend to see free markets as being the most rational system, and they're following from a school of economics called the Austrian school on this matter. Hayek, people like that are the ones who are the sort of big names for it. The idea with it is that the economy is just far too complicated for any agency or group of agencies to try and rationalize it. And in attempting to do so, you just make things worse. So the idea would be, so something like price. Why does something cost the way it does? Money is in many ways, well, so even let's say I had a 100 rial bill in front of me. What is it worth? The paper itself is obviously not worth 100 rial, not even close. But it represents, say, a certain type of value, whether it's in terms of like gold storage by the government, if it's in terms of the general economic power of a country, like say for the Americans, in terms of the floating exchange rate, things of that type. But primarily that 100 rial serves as an information tool. Basically, it's signaling my preferences to someone else. So if, say, I'm getting a cup of coffee, okay, someone offers to give me a medium coffee for 5 rial. Cool, good, I'll take it. 10 rial, yeah, sure, still will. 15 rial. Getting a little more edgy, but okay, well, we'll still go with that. 20 rial. Maybe some days I will, some days I won't. 25 rial. No, I'm done. I'm not going to buy it anymore. This is a signaling device. So for someone who's selling coffee, they can see, okay, if I'm selling it for 5 rial, pretty much everyone's going to buy it, but it's probably going to cost me more than that to sell it, to create it and then be able to sell it to someone. 10 rial, fewer people will buy, but still a goodly amount. 15 rial, well, less people, but still enough to be manageable for me to be able to make a profit. 20 rial, now we're getting to the point where it's getting a little more sketchy. 25 rial, I'm going to go out of business because no one's going to buy it. Money is an information tool. And the idea with the sort of Austrian school view the Republicans have, or many of them do in any case, is that this type of signaling is going on billions of times a day. People deciding off their basis of their own preferences, what they want to do, signaling to a business that then responds to it. But these types of interactions are going on constantly. And this is what makes it too complex for a government to handle. Because yes, there's going to be certain types of fluctuations, of course. But the notion is the more you remove artificial restrictions on the market, the more you can allow for this kind of free flow of information, of preference signaling, to get to sort of basically the equilibrium of supply and demand, to get to the proper cost of things. Versus if you try and rationalize it. Because if you try and do that, you're basically trying to simplify very badly, trying to simplify all of these sorts of complications. So the usual example would be someplace like, again, like the Soviet Union, which had a planned economy. So again, sort of idea of government itself coordinating things like prices and so on and so forth, as well as say supply. can't remember if it was Yugoslavia or Romania, but there was one of the running examples and gags was that Romania would have this problem where they'd have a large excess of the number of refrigerators that people would buy. They would just have refrigerators stuffed in warehouses because they couldn't get rid of them. But also that people tended to run out of toilet paper very quickly. The reason was, according to the planning by the government, most likely the population was going to need X number of refrigerators and Y amount of toilet paper, because rationally it was determined. Now in practice, it turns out that no, their estimates were off, but there was no way of trying to correct for it, versus say like a free market system where if say less people are buying refrigerators, the firms will probably start selling less or start selling them at a higher price. Similarly, if people are buying a whole bunch of toilet paper, they will try and produce more. So instead of being irrational, it's the most rational. So therefore, less government intervention is key. This comes on to the second point of, again, that thing mentioned briefly before, the notion of a perverse incentive system. That one of the big problems with government intervention as well is that it can start picking winners and losers. Not based on the common good, not based on what would be the most economically rational, but based on things like who are your constituents, who will benefit from this. So for instance, one of the issues could be something like bureaucratic capture. So the notion would be, okay, if we start regulating pharmaceutical companies, for instance, okay, we're going to need to put together some sort of bureaucratic body to be able to figure out the regulations. Who is the most trained and who's the most experienced with pharmaceutical technology and business to be able to do this? The businesses themselves. So something that happened during the Roosevelt administration, when making regulatory agencies, usually they were bringing in people from the largest businesses who happened to make the regulations benefit themselves. So for instance, let's take something like say, ergonomic requirements. So to make sure that the chairs are correct and the seating is correct so that people who are working in your office don't start getting back pain, carpal tunnel syndrome, things of that type. Oftentimes, these sort of regulations apply to businesses of greater than 100 employees or greater than 500 employees, the bigger companies in the US. Because the notion is that a bigger company can afford to do that more. Good, but getting to this winner and loser problem, it also means that if you're a smaller business who's building up, if you get to 99 employees and you're thinking, okay, we want to expand our business, if you move to 101, in terms of regulatory costs, in terms of other sort of problems, your operation costs are probably going to quadruple. Those 2 employees are probably not going to add 4 times the amount of profit you had previously. You're just not going to be able to afford it, but it acts as a sort of artificial barrier to expansion. This has to be one of their concerns. Having said that, just like with the Democrats, this is something that's changed somewhat over the last 5 or 6 years. Generally, you start seeing a larger portion of the Republican Party that's more aligning with, say, skilled trades, workers, people of that type versus, say, larger businesses. And again, part of this is a constituency change that's occurred over time. So if you're looking at, say, something like some of the disruptions of the Republican Party with the rise of someone like Trump, part of it is this sort of distinction about how much government intervention there should be in the economy. Those who are sort of more supporting, or more populist, supporting workers, skilled trade, smaller types of business people tend to be much more accepted of certain types of intervention than those who came previously were much more non-interventionist. And this is a dispute that's still going on. Then on to social issues. And again, this being something that's much more mixed. So when it comes to sexual or reproductive issues, the Republicans are much more willing to use intervention to maintain traditional norms. And this can also fall into things like religion as well. So the idea would be increased restrictions on abortion or increased restrictions on things like birth control or things of that type, but also in terms of things like norms. So for instance, one that you've seen this come up in various types of local schools. And when we're talking about education, probably something like this is going to come up again. So certain types of local school districts have started having something called, let's see if I remember the name of it correctly, Drag Queen Story Hour is as memory serves. So it would be like a local library or something like that, and a transgender person who's wearing a lot of makeup or a dress or something like that will read stories to kids, so 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds inside a public library. The notion being that this is trying to help with removing prejudice and discrimination, trying to expose children early to the vibrant diversity of gender identity, things of that type. For Republicans, the idea is that, okay, well, this is a man in a dress reading to 5-year-olds and maybe talking about rather sexually explicit things to kids who are too young to really know about this. For the Republicans, the idea would be, okay, say remove funding from the library, ban them from doing things like this. Or say if you're looking at some of the various debates going on in school boards lately, to ban certain types of books. So I think there's one recently where some library, there was among the things inside one of the stories was some drawings of 2 underage boys giving each other oral sex or something like that. It was available for like 11-year-olds. The Republicans would say, okay, yeah, that book's got to be out of this. No, we're not going to have any of that. It's a public library. This is bordering on, that may pass the level of being something obscene and pornographic. This doesn't belong in a kid's library. Much more willing to have that kind of intervention. Having said that, there are other places where they tend to be much more willing to have less intervention. It can be almost very interventionist, very libertarian, I should say. So things like hate speech being a big one, saying, okay, what counts as hate speech, even if some sort of speech is viciously offensive and unpleasant, that's how free speech works. People should be allowed to say what they wish. This also comes up on certain types of health issues. So again, going with things like, say, the vaccine mandate and so forth, where you're seeing them pushing very strongly against having these kinds of restrictions and so forth. The notion being, in a sense, that people have a choice to be able to do these things. And they may not be the best choice, but having the choice, the ability to make that choice yourself is important. I mean, so the idea would be, let's say you could live a completely safe life, but the requirement for that completely safe life is that someone else is making every decision for you. You might have a long life, but it may not really be worth much in many ways, is sort of the notion. Or as one of my colleagues would oftentimes say, that everyone has the right to choose their own path to hell. Someone wants to be really fit, healthy, focus on all these things, great. Someone wants to be viciously unhealthy, that's their choice, is sort of the idea, at least for this element of republicanism. So one final issue. Is partisanship more prevalent today? So partisanship basically meaning sort of a party spiritedness, taking one's own side and kind of demonizing the other side. Because in a lot of ways, it seems like partisanship is pretty bad. And if you're looking at, say, many reports in the press, whether at the national or the state level, they tend to talk about the concerning rise in partisanship, which they've been talking about now for about 15 years, if not more. Is it worse than it was in the past? That's kind of hard to say. If we're looking historically, the Americans have tended to be pretty partisan. It's kind of our way. So one of my favorite examples is the election for the presidency in 1800 of John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. Both of these guys were heroes of the Revolutionary War. They were two of the big names during the move for independence. Both of them had served in George Washington's administration. They're both big names. They're both very important. John Adams being one of the big statesmen involved in this sort of thing. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who authored the Declaration of Independence. These aren't dark horse individuals who've come out of nowhere. They're known quantities. That said, during the 1800 election, so John Adams was just finishing his first term, Thomas Jefferson is running against him. Adams supporters said that Thomas Jefferson was a complete atheist and that if he became president, he would start burning Bibles, basically purge out religion, basically follow the French Revolution. So you had people, when he was elected, who started basically burying their Bibles to make sure that they didn't get purged out. While Jefferson supporters accused Adams of secretly being a monarchist who really wanted to bring back something like the British monarchy, and if he got to be president again, he would declare himself king for life, and he would start basically putting all the types of tyranny that happened before into practice again. Yeah, the Americans have kind of been partisan since the start. It's just sort of been our way. Having said that, one of the things that does seem to be more prevalent now is because of the rise of new media. So, in effect, it's much easier to express partisanship now than it used to be. You don't need a printing press, you don't need a newspaper, you don't need anything like that. As long as you have an internet connection and a social media account, you can pretty much express your views as much as you see fit, and can kind of lead towards more, especially more prevalent partisanship. Because many people who wouldn't have been involved at all with politics, or not really, are now engaging in it much more frequently. So for instance, just thinking about something like Facebook, thinking of some of the folks I know there, chances are if we went back, say, 30 years, where you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have these sort of things, yeah, these sort of individuals, many of them would watch the news on television or read a newspaper, and they might find something agitating around politics, but in terms of their day-to-day interaction with people, probably wouldn't come up too much. A couple of them would still be focused on it, most of them wouldn't. Now it's a lot easier, and there's also more of a sort of social pressure. So, for instance, I guess in the last 2 days, I guess the US Embassy in Yemen just got overrun, maybe some sort of hostage situation, things like that. In previous days, people would have looked at that and said, oh boy, that's not great. And then maybe we would have thought, oh, the president's being an idiot, or they think, okay, this is some sort of situation in which the government has no control. But then they would probably move on to whatever else. They have other things to do. But now there's much more pressure of the, okay, so to express my view of whether I think the president is being an idiot, or this is something beyond the government's control or its responsibility of the previous administration, especially if I see someone else taking a position I don't like. This can kind of ramp things up rather significantly. So to a certain extent, is it more prevalent today? Certainly partisanship has existed in the United States since basically the US started. But it does seem to be something where there's much more of the public is involved than it was previously. Whether that's going to be a problem or not is something we'll probably see over the next few years. So before continuing, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts over anything dealing with political parties? Oh, and actually, as I think about it, before we get to the questions, let me just shut off the recording real quick.